Both me, my parents, and my brother believe in ghosts. My dad had some really terrifying things happen to him in his teens, but I won't be sharing those stories today. Instead, this is a story from the early 90s. When I was pretty much born, my parents decided to take a break from each other, so my dad moved to an apartment not far from where they lived together, so that they'd live close to each other. Things started out slightly at first. To give you perspective, there weren't any mailboxes in these apartment blocks. Instead, there were tiny little hatches on every door where the mailman would put stuff in. Stuff like your newspaper and bills would just fall down and land in your hallway floor, ready for you to pick up whenever you came home. British style. One day, my dad came home from work and noticed there was nothing on the floor. Not unusual at all, right? He took his jacket and shoes off and walked into the kitchen, only to find his mail perfectly and neatly stacked on the kitchen table. He didn't give it much thought. It was probably just the landlord's caretaker that had been in his apartment, maybe doing some maintenance or something, and picked up his mail as a friendly gesture. Knowing the caretaker, he called him up immediately just to make sure, but he denied he'd been there. After this, it started to get worse. A few days later, my mum called and asked if he wanted to go for a walk with her, me, and my older brother. Sure thing, my dad said. He said that he'd get ready right away and see them outside in a minute. After switching off the TV, excess lights, and all that stuff you usually do before going away for a while, he walked out, and upon coming back some 45 minutes later, noticed that the lights were all on in the kitchen and bathroom. These windows were the only ones located on the front side of the house. On the back side was the garden, where the living room and bedrooms were located. "That's weird," he said to my mum. "I'm sure I turned all the lights off before we left." But she hadn't really thought about it. "Maybe you just forgot the kitchen," she remarked. They walked into the indoor stairwell. He unlocked the door, opened it, and walked inside, and froze immediately. Every single lamp inside his apartment had been turned on. Fast forward an unknown amount of time. This was by far the most terrifying experience he had, and he even decided to move out not long afterwards. I also need to give you some perspective as to how these apartments were designed. When you walked in the front door, you had the kitchen straight forward at the end of the hallway, and the bathroom door was located on the right side, right before the kitchen door. So my father was shaving, trimming, or buzzing his beard or whatever at the sink bathroom. Above the sink hung a mirror that, when looked into, allowed you to see out into the hallway behind you. Suddenly he saw a dark figure dressed in a coat and what looked like a bowler hat coming from the kitchen, and walk past behind him towards the door leading outside. The shape also seemed to be covering its face with its hand as it passed by. My dad froze until we heard the door open and slam shut, so hard that it nearly sent the paintings hanging off the wall from their hooks. He dropped the trimmer into the sink basin and rushed out to catch another glimpse of whatever he just saw. He got outside not more than 5 seconds after the shape had slammed the door, but there was not a soul outside. Nobody could possibly have gotten away that fast. My dad went back inside and got his shoes, and instantly walked out of the landlord's office. After presenting himself, he asked if any other tenant who lived in the apartment before him had reported anything strange going on. The lady at the counter, having pulled up the records, went silent for a second and then said, "I'm not actually allowed to tell you this, but for the last 2 years, all of the 5 tenants moved out within half a year of moving in." My dad asked who the 7th tenant was before him, and she told him his name was Harold. Last name I can't remember. He recognized the name but couldn't remember from where. He did, however, recall that my grandma might have an idea, so he called her and asked if she knew someone by that name. Turns out she indeed used to have an acquaintance by that name, but his life had been ended tragically 2 years ago. I'm not sure, but I think his life was ended over a gambling debt, she said. So that's why he was covering his face, if he even had one left to say things from. Several years later, when me and my brother were in our teens, my dad liked to move around a lot in the city. He must have moved every 1 to 2 years, and by chance he was offered a viewing on an apartment in the same area, and of course he went. Upon arriving, he realized it was the very same apartment he had been living in some 15 years ago. Mostly everything looked the same inside except new floors and wallpaper. Afterwards, he and my brother went fishing not too far from there, and upon returning home, walking along a pretty long dirt road with wheat fields on both sides, my dad gets slapped in the face so hard his glasses flew off. My brother chuckled and asked, "What did that?" My brother instantly knew. He took it as a warning not to return and called up the office getting home and declined the offer. This story isn't mine, but my father's. My dad is an engineer, and when he was younger he planned and oversaw roads being built to distant villages in our city. So he was always traveling and was always with other engineer drivers of big machines. Our city has a lot of history, especially Byzantium and Ottoman, and treasure hunting is a really common thing, although illegal. In one of his travels, a group of his spoke with the chief of a village that was really remote, and they talked about a rumor on Byzantium treasure being buried near the old mill. Being a skeptic, my father didn't care about it, but one of the drivers, Ahmed, took it seriously, and he was interested in treasure hunting too, so he persuaded 2 other drivers to search for this treasure. So, when they gave a break from working, they took pickaxes and shovels from villagers to begin digging around the old mill. The mill is near water and in a small valley, and my father is on top of a nearby hill chilling and watching these guys. This next part is described by one of the other drivers to my father after the accident. They dug for an hour, and after that Ahmed hit something hard and dug further and reached a small stone arch. According to them, the stones looked like regular stones, but its shape and place were weird, so they thought that they must have found it. They dig further and opened a door under the arch that led to a clearing, but it was dark as hell, and they had small lanterns, but they got afraid, so Ahmed volunteered to enter. It was from this point my father was witnessing it. As soon as he put his head in the door, he screamed like he was in tremendous pain, got out of the hole and started running like crazy, swinging his pickaxe upwards and saying, "Get it off me," repeatedly. This lasted for 2 minutes. My father ran to help the guy, and the 2 others tried to get the pickaxe and calm him down. They removed the pickaxe from him, but he was still shouting, "Get it off me, please," and looking upwards, until he passed out. I kid you not. My father says that Ahmed stayed in a coma for 2 weeks, and was blind for 2 weeks after he woke up. Naturally, my father and others asked what happened, and he says that as soon as he put his head inside that place, he saw 2 black floating humanoid entities with really long limbs, and they dived to him and started to attack. He didn't see anything but these 2 things circling really fast and attacking him from above, and finally he says they overwhelmed him. He also said their attacks were like millions of bee stings, touching every part of his body at the same time, and it hurt really bad. Eventually, Ahmed recovered from his physical pain, but according to my father, after that day he always finished his jobs really quickly and left the place and never stuck around after work. My mother has always spoken of a haunting that has bothered her ever since her youth. She talks about hearing footsteps when no one else was home, waking up at night to find a black figure in the corner watching her and her sister. Both my mum and her sister witnessed this event in their teens. My mum speaks of seeing red eyes in glass on occasion, eyes that watch her until she looks away and they're gone. I am convinced there is a malevolent being following the women in my family. But me being the only person who has travelled for an extended time away from the area, I still find it when I stay in one place for too long. When I was a baby, my mum said I creeped her out by telling her there was a black cat in the house. She says I would often point at it and track it around the room, telling my parents what it was doing. This may be normal for infants and toddlers, so take it with a grain of salt. Both my parents confirm that when moving from place to place when I was young, that after a few weeks or months of staying in a place, bumps in the night would show up before long. These were often paired with bad dreams, bad luck, and things like real-life pay cuts and layoffs, as well as odd behavior from me as a toddler. As a toddler, I was terrified of the dark, and often pointed at corners or nooks and crannies saying there was a monster watching me. I don't remember this though. My memories of the being started around when I was 5 or 6. My parents had finally settled down in a real 2-story home and planned to be there for years. We would stay here until I was 18, and here I lived with a haunting of sorts. My first experience was when I went to shower as a young child. Showering and self-bathing were kind of rare, and I was excited to take my evening shower. With a towel in hand, I walked past my parents' bedroom. I glanced into the room to see a dark figure leaning over my mum's side of the bed. I was mid-stride when I saw it, so I ended up walking past the door. I took a step back and it was gone when I checked again. From there, bumps in the night became a thing of normalcy. My bedroom was located right at the top of the staircase to the upper floor, and about 3 to 4 times a week I would wake up around 1 or 2 and listen to footsteps that would start in the living room downstairs, come up the stairs, and pace around the upstairs hallway, as well as pace up and down the stairs. My dad refused to acknowledge this, and always told me the house was just settling at night. But the footsteps terrified me, because they were not random, but rather in a clear path that was always different from night to night. Things like this became very normal. I was homeschooled for a time via K-12 online learning, so I spent a lot of time at home alone during the day. Footsteps throughout the day, even ones that sounded like stomping, as well as sounds of chairs being scooted across the floor and TVs turning on, were very normal. While they were unsettling, they were just something we all lived with. My sister refused to sleep alone and often came into my bed at night because she said she saw people watching her. More than a few times, if my sister came to my room, I would always hear footsteps go into her room at night. My room and hers shared a wall, and twice I could hear something touching the wall on the other side, like a hand moving across it. Occasionally I would hear her door open and close, and she told me stories of seeing horrifying things at night. This was extremely normal, yet my dad refused to talk about it, and my mother would simply ignore it. At this time I had no clue about my mum's history with this being, or my dad's experience with it. So one night I became bold. I wanted the hard truth of what was happening. Any time I went out into the hallway to see the being, the footsteps would stop. If my door was open, they would stop the second I got out of bed. If my door was closed, they would stop when I opened my door. I wanted more solid proof, so my mum brought me to a motion sensor alarm. It was a simple thing, turned on with a button, and sounded like a beeping alarm when something passed in front of it. I placed it on the half wall that overlooked the staircase and went to sleep. I woke up that night again around 2 or so, and heard the footsteps coming from the living room downstairs. They came up the stairs, and I was really excited to see what would happen. As the footsteps got closer to the landing, they stopped, and I felt an immense sense of dread, like I had opened a Pandora's box, and I did not want to know what was inside it. Sure enough, after a few moments of silence, the alarm went off. It was like my reality had been shattered. It was really happening. After a few seconds, the alarm went off again, only this time it kept going off. It would beep through its alarm and start again, and I knew I had to turn off the damn thing. I got out of bed, and it kept going off. I stood behind my door, hyped myself up, threw the door open, snatched the alarm, and whipped back to my room. Sure enough, the alarm was now dead silent. I waved my hand in front of it, and it went off as normal. I'm convinced to this day the being was standing in front of me, only I couldn't see it. From here, things get considerably worse. Bumps in the night became something now my entire family were witnessing at once. Everyone downstairs at night, and a clear stomping through the upstairs. One afternoon I came home with my mum, and we heard a clear shattering noise from upstairs, and my mum's glass candle, while still in its spot, but now shattered in pieces. The family all came home one night, and we all heard clearly 2 footsteps on the top of the stairs, like something was running away from us. Dad went through the house with a shotgun, Remington Model 870 Wingmaster for those who care, only to find the house devoid of others but us. I had more and more vivid encounters with the being. One night I woke up to something sitting on the edge of my bed. Something I couldn't see clearly sat on the end, depressing the mattress and shaking the bed. I watched as my covers then slowly were pulled off my feet, and felt a distant tickling on my feet. To this day, I will not sleep without tucking my feet into the covers. It was around this time that my grandfather passed away. Myself and my parents went up to the funeral while my sister, who was only 6 or 7, stayed with a sitter. I never saw his body. However, only a few days after, my sister came screaming downstairs to my mum and myself, saying there was a monster in the bathroom. A man with a puffy face and purple ears. My mum became incredibly upset, as my grandfather was diabetic and died from gangrene. His blood had pooled into his face, causing it to swell, and his ears to go a purple black. My mum was now convinced this being was somehow my grandfather, but I am convinced it only used the image of my grandfather to torment her. It would continue to use his image later in the experiences. In the basement, my entire family felt odd where our water heater sat. It was in the corner of the basement and formed a little nook where our fuse box sat behind it. We all said that we felt like something was always watching us from there, and it became so disturbing that my dad built a wall between the rest of the basement and that spot, though it didn't really help any of us at all. I now believe the malevolent being would find a nook or cranny they call home, and that is their resting place, and it seems they're usually not far from some kind of power source, and I wonder if they can somehow pull power from it. In addition, talking about it made it much worse, and strife in the family, like my mother's affair, made activity violently ramp up. Mum and Dad still refused to really talk about it, as Mum was convinced the more we spoke, the worse it would get. My dad simply denied any belief of the occurrences. Our dogs at night would lay in crates in the basement and would often growl and bark at night to be let out. While we all saw this as normal, no one liked going into the basement to get them. Since we moved to Alabama, where we live in a valley between 2 hills, our dogs no longer bark to be let out at night and wait until morning. My mum spoke of a time when our dog Sasha had puppies. She talked about sitting with our dog petting the puppies, when Mum felt a cold snap behind her. At that moment, Sasha began growling and barking in the empty space, and my mum felt the cold. She was convinced the dogs could see the being. So, Let's get into some really horrible stuff. My defining moment of actually watching the being manipulate its environment is when my grandmother came to visit. She slept downstairs in the living room on the couch, but complained after a few nights as she wanted someone else down there with her. So I did that. The first night I woke up around the same time to nothing out the ordinary. However, I looked out the window to see bunnies in our front yard munching my mum's garden. This was really cool to me, so I decided to stay up the next night and watch them. The next night I stayed up, watching out the window for critters to show up. Sometime late at night, probably around the same time things usually happen, I heard a thud from the basement, then footsteps up the basement staircase. I was convinced this being rested in the basement during most of the day. I sat glaring at the basement floor for what felt like hours, hoping to Christ that nothing would happen. I could see the reflection in our kitchen lights moving on the knob, and sure as hell the door slowly opened only a few degrees and then shut. At least the being is polite enough to close the door behind it. The footsteps then came through the living room towards me, and the reclining chair only a few feet from me began to turn as the footsteps passed by me. The steps then went upstairs. I took my ass back upstairs, shut my door, and went to bed. From here the being began messing with me nightly. I would wake up at night feeling a cold breath on my face, and I would watch as the drawstring to my blinds would start violently swinging, and the dial on my floor fan would turn on and off, fast and slow. This became a normal occurrence over a few months. At this point in time, we all honestly became used to our being, even joking about it when we witnessed weird stuff. You have to live life, and bumps in the night can't stop you from going to work or school and doing homework. One night, my dad and I are standing at the top of the staircase, just talking, and we both hear one of the chairs scoot from downstairs, and my pack of art pencils falls on the ground. Dad looks at me and laughed. I guess it's up for the night. I started trying to talk to it, ask it what it was and if it was actually my grandfather. This was a huge mistake, as now I would get feelings of someone watching me all the time, coupled with things like papers and books being pushed off tables in front of me, and feeling someone physically touch me throughout the day, as well as horrible nightmares. The nightmares all had a consistent theme. I'm doing something normal when something paranormal starts to happen. I react with anger, and then the event becomes so out of control that my anger turns to dread. Something will then happen involving the color red, like red light seeping in from under a door or through a window, accompanied by some kind of deafeningly loud noise. I'd then wake up, believing I was about to be hurt. This actually trained me to do something in real life, where I can now force myself awake from a bad dream. Cool trick, but I wish I'd never needed. My girlfriend at the time started complaining a lot about weird stuff around her house, and let it be known, I did not talk to people about these occurrences. I never wanted to be seen as weird or insane. She talked about someone touching her at night, turning lights on and off, and someone stomping through her house. So we started Skype chatting all through the night, leaving the call on while we slept. She complained about hearing voices from my end, but I still don't believe her. One night I woke up to blaring static through the call, which makes sense to me, as if sound levels drop off for long enough, the call will balance to white noise. I grabbed my phone to turn the call off, but something inside me told me to just watch. I watched as her covers were pulled off her chest, and something began picking at her shirt, like literally her shirt was being pulled up by an invisible hand. Ended the call, never told her for knowing it would probably make it worse. It got to a point where I was having experiences at her house. Random stomping through her house, as well as one time she left me in her room to make food. I watched as her lights switch, turned off and on literally in front of my eyes. I walked out the room and muttered something like, "Good to see you, buddy." And, no lie, the light in the hallway and her room both switched off. She started saying she was having dreams about a dark figure watching her through her doorway at night. Bad stuff all around. And it gets worse. The being is now becoming much more ballsy. I wake up one night, and often I would look at my wall opposite to a massive window I had. We had a willow tree in the back, and a power plant behind that. It was far away but cast this orange light in my room at night, painting a somewhat gorgeous shadow of the willow branches and leaves, swaying in the wind. I often watched this at night when I couldn't sleep. But one night I wake up. No creepy stuff to speak of, so I go look at my wall. There is now a clear outline of a man. The shadows of the tree are somewhat blurry from how far away the light source and trees are, but the being is crisp and clear. It is slowly swaying in the branches. I said something like, "Okay then," and turned around and went to sleep. The next night I watched the shadow for hours, but no figure appeared. I honestly forgot about it happening, and a few weeks later I woke up and sure as hell it's there again, but now in a different spot, away from the tree shadow. It's in its own spot. It's completely still. I got a little ballsy too, and decided to go up to it, so I got up, walked over, and it was only a few inches shorter than me. I couldn't see an outline of ears, but clearly a man's shadow. I touched the wall. It wasn't cold or burning hot. Nothing was honestly out of the ordinary. I calmed down standing in front of this thing and said something like, "You're confident?" And the head turned towards me. I shook my head in disbelief and went downstairs to make a coffee, only to never see it again. After that, my dad went on a hunting trip downstate, only a few hours away. He'd be gone a week. Mum is having sobbing episodes, saying at night she can smell cherry tobacco smoke like her father used to have. I swept this off and told her it was probably just nearby garbage burns. She started sleeping downstairs with the dogs in the room. My sister started complaining about things bothering her at night, but apparently way worse than normal. She won't say what, but she starts sleeping downstairs with my mum and dogs. So I stay upstairs by myself. I go to bed, and I can hear what sounds like our kitchen stool hitting the living room floor. Well, my mum and sister are down there, so it's probably them. I'm laying in bed. I can't sleep. My ears are full of this crushing, bass-like noise. I feel like something bad is about to happen, but I don't know what to do. I turned in bed and looked at my floor fan, and it then turns towards my door and flops over, but with some air like it was thrown a bit. I freaked out, started sobbing and ran downstairs. Everyone freaked out. While Dad was at his trip, he fell down a hill into poison ivy and suffered a lot of cuts on his hand. Omens, man. That morning, Mum asks me if I tripped on the stool, and I told her I didn't. The stool was at the bottom of the staircase, so I stood it up and pushed it over. We both agreed that wasn't the sound. I pushed it off the bottom step and it still didn't sound right. From there, I picked up the stool to where she could just barely not see it behind the couch and dropped it. Sure as hell, she gasped. We both did, because it was the same noise. Who knows? Shortly after I graduated, we all moved to Alabama. We live between two hills in a bit of a valley, and the activity has entirely stopped. The feelings of being watched, the lingering fears, gone. It's like night and day difference. Now my parents have opened up to me. Mum explaining that her mother experienced these things too, and she thinks that my grandmother actually introduced this being into our lives because she talked about always regretting what she brought to us. What does this mean? I don't know, and it sounds too much like a horror movie for me to take it seriously. Mom now will tell us she's been dealing with it her entire life, but she says my experiences are not as bad as hers. She talks about being pushed out of bed, having the dogs in the room with her as they start growling at the door, and a shadow can be seen pacing from the light sweeping under it. She says there was more, but she doesn't want to talk about it. My sister refuses to speak of it, but again says that she's seen much worse than I have. Now, my dad talks about it. He says that because he stayed up late at night with online classes, he saw a lot of the weird stuff. Shadows passing by the open door. Things being moved while he watched. Things being moved to different places when he turned away or went to the bathroom. He says he never liked living in our old house. My family rarely leaves the state, but I do often because of continuing school up north and having long-distance relationships. My 2 girlfriends I've had since then complained when I stayed for too long. It seems to be the 3-week period. When I stayed with my girlfriend for a month after my grandma's funeral, the occurrences started up there. It was this feeling of being watched, an uneasy fear. It probably didn't help that her mother was super into talking to the dead, seances and stuff. Well, one night I'm laying in bed with my girlfriend on my stomach, and someone clearly comes stomping to the foot of the bed. I'm expecting to see her mother trying to catch us doing the dirty, and I turn around, but there's no one there. But there is cold wafting over me. I lay back down, and when I close my eyes, I see 2 red eyes within my eyelids. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, looked around the room, and sure as hell, they were there, in a mirror, in her kitchen. 2 bright red ovals. I stared at them for hours. Mum wasn't lying. I actually use these eyes in my art. When I draw a demon or a skull, I always put them in the socket. I kind of whispered to it, that I knew what it was and that I wasn't afraid. I felt a touch on my shoulder, looked away, looked back, and it was gone. At this point, my girlfriend's mum comes shambling into the room, saying that weird stuff is going on, and that you guys have got to get to my room. So myself, my girlfriend and her mum and 2 sisters are in the room, and we're just listening to stomping and stuff being knocked over and moved in the rest of the house. Eventually it stops, and we fall asleep. I go visit my friend on his wedding. I'm only there a few days. I planned to be there for 3 but stayed longer, and after I left he told me he had an awful nightmare of being in a recliner chair, one that started spinning, and red lights began filling the room with the sound of screaming filling his ears. He doesn't dream much, so it bothered him. He then talked about hearing someone walking around in his house and lights turning on and off when he left the rooms, but again, it eventually stops. Most recently, I went to visit my newish girlfriend, not the same one from earlier. She has a kid who has kind of become mine as well. All is normal, but she is much more interested in the spiritual. This is further south in Florida, where the land is flat. We start having weird things going on, hearing things in the apartment, and now her kid is waking up at night screaming and crying while he pulls the covers into him. She says this is abnormal for him, but again, children, so grains of salt. I start getting weird feelings, but I'm trying to shake them off. But one night her kid starts crying again, only this time he isn't wailing, he's whispering, in this sheepish cry for mummy to come help. She freaks out because he apparently doesn't do this. I go to open the door and I feel a quick 1-2 thud on the door from the other side. I'm thinking, crap, I hit him with the door. I push the door open, he's cowering in the corner. My girlfriend asks me why I took so long to open the door. I didn't know what to think at this point. The last point was now we had decided to sleep in the bed with him, instead of sneaking off the couch in the other room. I'm getting a weird feeling, but whatever. Her child then sits up in the night and is pointing at the door telling me to open it. I tell him to go to bed and he starts screaming, "Okay, I'll get the damn door." I open the bedroom door and he's now waving his hand from one corner of the room to the door, saying, "Get out!" Creepy, okay, but he's barely 2, and again, grains of salt. Keep in mind he speaks in pretty much single words. This is now the clearest I've ever heard him speak. He stops crying, looks down at the bed, and says clear as day, "Every goddamn weekend." I shoot out of bed, and I'm freaking out. My girlfriend grabs him, and she's freaking out. And we put up cameras the next morning and haven't had an incident since. So now I'm back home. And again, nothing weird to report. My girlfriend says it's the iron in the hills keeping the being from getting to us, but I don't know. Maybe she's right. She likes tarot cards, and says that she can kind of gather that there is something following the female line in the family, and that it's not of this world, meaning the spirit isn't human. Perhaps she's right, but it still seems far-fetched to me. What concerns me is that by using a pendulum with an alphabet, she'd tried talking to it, and it spelled out a name that neither of us remember what it was by now. The only thing weird that happened here is that my mother and I had the same dream one night. We don't talk much, with me being full-time in school in the local area and now working full-time. But one night I had a dream where I walked to the top of my staircase and a black figure was in our yard watching me. But not like the figure I saw up north. This was taller, skinnier, and I didn't feel threatened, only intrigued. Like my other dreams, I started to get mad. But now, it was in front of me. I fell on my back and woke up in my bed. I looked over to my door, which was shut, and went back to sleep. The same night I dreamt I was in my bed, the same position I went to sleep in, and turned over to my door. My door was now open, and the being was leaning in my door, watching me. I rolled over and then woke up to the being close as it was before. I fell asleep. Just a dream. That morning my mum said she had a really weird dream that a dark figure was watching her through the door while she was in bed. She said it felt real, like she may not have been dreaming. I told her I had the exact same dream, and we were both convinced it's an actual being, but not the one we're used to. This was not threatening or harming us in any way. I'll call it the Wanderer. I think it's simply curious, maybe trapped in the hills. I have never seen it or had another bad experience since then, which, at this point, was some years ago now. Most recently, we took a family trip to Nashville and stayed in a hotel for a few nights. We weren't talking about our experiences, so the dream kind of came out of nowhere. But I dreamed that I was standing in our old yard up north, and my mum was maybe 10 feet away from me standing by the road. A black figure was behind her and put a hand on her shoulder and told me, "I will never stop following. I will always find you." That honestly might have been a dream, but I don't know. My mother and sister apparently have had much worse experiences than me, which horrifies me because what I've seen is no laughing matter. You can think I'm crazy, you can think whatever you want. I'm not a crazy paranormal junkie. I will note, however, I cannot find anything on the internet pertaining to the red eyes, other than they symbolize an evil being. In BuzzFeed's Unsolved Stories, which I enjoy watching, people freak out in the dark as much as anyone, and they'll talk about the Sally house having spiked activity in a cracked wall. This reinforces to me that evil beings will find a nook or cranny to call home. Furthermore, I'm convinced there is a world within our own, a world of truly evil spirits and beings we don't understand. I don't know how much I believe in God or in heaven, but I believe in hell or something like it, and demonic entities that call this world home. I know my son has been here before. Everyone who meets him makes the same comment, along the lines of that he knows too much for his age. The first comment was a few months ago, when we were walking the 2 dogs and he randomly said, "Mum, remember before when I was laying in that field?" And my face was in the mud, and the gunshots were over my head. My feet were so wet. I stopped dead in my tracks. I replied that he had never been round guns, and that he was only 6, so everywhere he goes I'm with him. He was adamant that it had happened, and that he remembered crying and lying there hoping he didn't get shot. I tried to comfort him by saying it was probably a dream, and that if he ever had a nightmare like that, he should wake me up and we could talk about it. He didn't say anything more about it for the remainder of the day. A few days later we were eating dinner, and he said out of nowhere, "I remember when I picked you up by my mum." I asked what he meant, and he said when he was lying in the mud with the gunshots, he doesn't remember anything from that point. He then said he was a baby, and he was sitting on his bedroom floor playing with a toy car, and he heard banging outside the window, but the window had tape all over it. He heard a really, really loud bang, and then that was the end. And he then picked me. I think I'd probably turned a pale shade of grey at this point. However, he didn't seem much distressed. "Perhaps this was a dream," I said. He shook his head and said, almost frustrated, that this was before. I said, "What's before?" And he said, almost as if it was stupid of me not to know, "You know, Mum, before?" I just nodded and agreed, but I was both confused and freaked. I spoke to people about this and they all had the same opinion. This was my son remembering past lives in the war. Obviously I knew what he was getting at, but I was so confused as to why he would know details such as taping windows to stop the glass from shattering back in World War II here in the UK. But this wasn't the end of his before memories. A month or so ago he was sitting with my grandfather, which is his great-grandfather, and he gave him a £5 note as pocket money. My son said thank you and was playing with the note. My son then pointed to a picture on the note and said to my granddad that the picture was of a great Prime Minister. For those of you who aren't from the UK, the £5 note has a picture of Winston Churchill on it. My granddad was extremely taken aback by this and said he was right. My granddad updated me on this when I came back to pick my son up to go home and asked whether it was something I had told him. I said no, and that it was probably something that he was taught at school. At the next opportunity I asked his teacher whether they were teaching the children about the war or past prime ministers, and she said no, that they wouldn't be learning anything like that until they were at least 9 or 10. Now fast forward to 4 days ago. My son woke up at the usual time in the morning, but he looked exhausted. I asked him if he was okay and he said he didn't sleep well. When I asked why, he replied with, "A man woke me up. He was nudging my arm." I asked whether he knew this man before, and he said, "Yeah, he was from before." By now I understood what he means from before. He said he had a green suit on and some badges on his chest. He was smiling at me, but he was so white. I asked whether it scared him and why he didn't wake me up to tell me. He responded with, "I wasn't scared, he was nice, and I haven't seen him in a long time." We haven't had anything said since, but please give me your opinions. My son isn't distressed by any of this, and he has spoken about past lives before, and we are adamant he is a reincarnation of a friend who died, who we named after him. Last summer, I was in our home in Turkey with just my dad. We live in the Netherlands. I was trying to sleep on a very stormy night with thunderbolts roaring up the clouds as it sounded near catastrophical in my ears while trying to sleep. I want to explain the layout of my room first so everyone can get a better perspective of what it is I'm about to tell you. If you can visualize a room as a square from the upside down view, you could see it literally as a rectangle. So in the upper right corner is a door to my balcony, and in the down right corner is where my bed is, and I'm sleeping facing the wall and my feet are facing the balcony door. So now it's getting tricky. As I'm laying there facing the wall, I am in a state. Can't really call it reality nor a dream world. It was as if I were in between. I hear the stormy weather, and I'm in the exact same position as I was trying to sleep in. But the thing is, I can't remember the moment I fell asleep. It was like there was no transition of me entering a dream state. But that aside, I started hearing people talk. At first, it felt normal for me, because it sounded like people were panicky, talking to each other, and I had this idea that this was because of the weather, like maybe something was happening during the storm. I was trying to focus on what they're saying. The amount of voices I was hearing was decreasing. It went from about a crowd of 10 to 20 to just 3. But the whole time I hadn't understood a word of everything that was said during this time. This is where it gets creepy. The leftover 3 voices I spoke about become clear, and I hear 3 female voices speak in Arabic. But the talking came from my balcony, and as soon as I noticed this, they stopped talking and started hearing one of them whistling a random melody and walk out of the balcony and heading towards me. With me facing the presence, with my back, and looking at the wall, I'm in shock, thinking if this is real or a dream, and at that point it stopped right behind my back whistling, and I get the feeling that it's inching closer and closer. There are goosebumps all over my body. I turn around screaming and see nothing, just my room, and there was no transition from waking up from a dream, since everyone can distinguish if you've had a dream or not. This left me truly horrified, and I started seeking answers, and everyone I went to with my story told me it was either a jinn or black magic. Anyway, I wish that there is someone to help me. And if you feel like you can, let me know. When my little sister was around 6 years old, she started talking about her imaginary friend named Charlie. She said he would come out of her closet late at night and scare her. My dad and stepmom just chalked it up to her having nightmares. For about 2 years, Charlie would visit her on a nightly basis, tormenting her and scaring her so badly she would always go to my parents' room to sleep. Eventually, she started drawing Charlie and hanging him up on her walls. The picture she drew scared me to death. It was just a dark figure with no features. How could a child think of something like this? My parents started to get very angry with her for waking them up almost every night. They told her to go back to sleep and blame it on nightmares. But one night, my parents got a very rude awakening. Around 2 or 3 a.m., my dad woke up to use the bathroom. When he opened the door to the hallway, he was startled and paralyzed with fear to see a very dark figure, featureless, motionless, and about 4 feet tall, standing right in front of him. He stood there for a second, watching this figure, not knowing what the hell it was. It was Charlie. Charlie ended up literally floating and disappearing into the door to my sister's room. He never again doubted why my sister was so scared of what she saw every night, and we ended up moving a few months later, and my sister, fortunately, has not seen Charlie since. I grew up in a really old house located in a small town in Iran. This house had 4 rooftops, 4 basements, 2 massive yards, and 3 separate parts for living. My great-grandfather, his siblings, and all their children used to live in this house. But by the time I was born, it was only my family consisting of 5 members that lived there. So most part of the house was deserted and really scary. The house being home to many bats made it quite scary. But the worst part was that there were around 15 people buried in the basement. All family members from the time of my great-grandfather and before that. Most of them were children. Seems like in the old days when children would die of illness upon being born, their parents would just bury them at home. So the house was creepy enough. But the town was also scary. Nearly all of its population believed the town to be the home of jinns. Stories about seeing these jinns were everywhere. During the 10 years that I lived there were many times that me and my family saw shadows passing. things being misplaced, the sound of footsteps, and we eventually got used to it. But there's a particular memory that I remember quite vividly. When I was 9 years old, I was playing hide and seek with my siblings and cousins. I was the seeker. There was this room with a huge window with pink curtains. The window would open to a hallway, and I was standing in the hallway. The window was open, and I saw that a very vivid white hand was grabbing on the curtains. I was sure it was my sister's hand. I stood there a bit, watching the hand, laughing with myself about how my fool sister had revealed where she was hiding. I went into the room. There was no one by the window. I searched the whole room, because I was sure she was there, but found no one. Then I ran out of the room and started screaming my lungs out. My siblings and cousins came out of their hiding places, and no one had hidden anywhere near that room. To this day, I am still haunted by the image of that hand. I have always been interested in hearing stories from my childhood. My mother recently told me some stories that weirded me out. When I was 4 years old, my mother was expecting. My parents hadn't told me about it yet. One day, my mum decided to try and tell me that I was about to have a little brother. She was scared to tell me because she thought I would be worried that I would be forgotten about. When she went to tell me, I placed my hand on her stomach and told her she didn't have to tell me because I already knew she was going to have a baby. She was completely shocked, considering no one had told me. Weirdly enough, I already knew. I'm not super religious at all, but I told her that God told me about it. I actually remember some of this next story. I'm not sure how far along she was with the pregnancy. All of my family was in the living room and we were discussing the new baby, names, appearances, and what we thought the gender would be. I said that it would be a boy, he'd be tan, have dark eyes and brown hair. I said he looked like an Indian. This was funny to them at the time because my family is fair-skinned. Fast forward a few months to when the baby was born. It was a boy and had all the traits that I had described. Me and my brother are pretty close now. I've always felt some sort of attachment to him. I don't know if these are weird to anyone else, but they spook me. I'm very interested in spiritual things and the supernatural, and I'd love to hear any of your comments on this. Was it a premonition? I was a lonely kid. My mum passed away when I was really young. My dad was absent most of the time during my childhood. I remember looking at my mum's picture. She was really beautiful in that blue dress. I often dream of her. In a dream, I'll tell her to come back and never leave me. The story started off when I was in high school. I'm a skeptic and never really believed in ghostly stuff. But some strange things had happened while I was living in a dorm. Well, it happened to anyone else but me. The dorm was pretty new. The first week had passed and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I invited some friends to hang out and we were drinking and having a good time. One of the girls seemed a bit upset as she kept checking the wall trying to listen to something. I asked her what was wrong and she replied, "I'm not sure, but I think I heard something from the room on the left. It sounded like someone's humming." "There's no room on the left. My room is the last one on this floor. Maybe it's just the sound of a wind or a creak," I replied, and continued to drink with other friends. All of us were pretty drunk. The same girl asked to stay the night, to which we said yes. The next morning when I awoke, I saw that girl sitting in the corner staring at the wall. Her body was shaking. She seemed scared and tired. Her eyelids were dark, so I assumed she didn't get much sleep, and I asked her if she was okay. She said that she was woken up by someone or something. When I looked at the end of my bed, I saw the lady in a blue dress standing there staring at me. I couldn't move nor scream. The lady was pointing a finger over to my bed. She was standing there the whole night. My friend started to cry, so I cheered him up. It was probably just a nightmare. You'd been watching too many horror movies. I dropped her home and she never contacted me again. A couple of months had passed, and my ex-girlfriend came to visit and stay for the night. Everything was okay. We watched movies, had a few drinks, and then went to sleep. She woke me up in the middle of the night and asked if I had tried to strangle her while I was asleep. "What's wrong with you?" I said. She said that she saw red hand marks around her neck and got freaked out, but I reassured her I'd never do anything like that. She looked confused too. I had 2 beds and we were sleeping separately, and there was some distance between the beds. When she finally calmed down, she told me she saw a dark shadow figure come on top of her and grab her by the neck. She tried to fight it off but couldn't move, and then she heard someone screaming, "Get out," over and over. I paused as I tried to think of the reasonable explanations. Sleep paralysis perhaps, overstressed, but it doesn't explain a very visible mark on her neck. That night we stayed up all night. She then broke up with me a few days later, hence the ex. Till this day, she wouldn't tell me what really happened with the shadow figure or where it went to. The incident would repeat itself over and over again. I got close with someone, she came to stay the night, got sleep paralysis with a crazy story, and then we broke up. It seems like my mum didn't want me to get a girlfriend. Please, Mum, why? As a non-believer, I started to ask myself, can this really happen? Are ghosts real? I was a junior monk before. I slept next to a graveyard and nothing had happened. I wanted to prove my hypothesis to see if my mum's ghost was real. I tried inviting her to me. I did a ritual. In Thai culture, by putting the dirt of a graveyard over your eyelids, you can allegedly see spirits. Good or bad, it doesn't matter. I did a Thai Ouija board game by myself in an attempt to communicate. I did one incense method in front of my room to call my mum's spirit to come to me, and nothing happened. Eventually I told her out loud, "Mum, I love you even if I can't see you. But if you're real and you're here, don't worry about me, I can take care of myself. I've been taking care of myself since Dad wasn't around that much. You don't have to worry about me. I'll come visit you at your graveyard every year. Please, rest in peace." It has been almost a decade now, and everything seemed to get back to normal. I don't have any problems getting along with anyone. No girl got spooked by something supernatural anymore. I saw, heard, and felt nothing, not even in a dream. To this day, I still ask myself if ghosts are real. Maybe they're real for some people. Maybe only few of us can sense them. Or maybe it was a total coincidence. When I was a toddler, I told my mum I wanted the tickle man to stop tickling me at night. She asked me what I meant. I told her a tall man tickles me at night. She kind of brushed it off as a dream. About 2 nights later, she hears me laughing in my room, and she hears me start to cry and say stop. My mum is freaked out. She runs into my room and finds me fast asleep and no one there. My dad worked nights. I have no siblings, and no one would have run away without her noticing since their paths would have crossed in the hallway. This happens again the following night, except my mum doesn't get up. Petrified, she calls out and says, "I don't know who you are or what you want, but you need to leave. He doesn't like it. You're scaring him. Please go away." I immediately stop crying. She goes in to check on me and the room is empty. The tickler never came back. Does anyone know what this could be? Ever since I was young, I have experienced strange things that I tried to listen to my parents about. They told me it was nothing. But now as an adult, I'm starting to doubt that. I'm a 33-year-old male. Once I woke up at night and the covers of my bed were being ripped off. The lights in the bathroom down the hall started turning on and off by themselves. I confirmed it wasn't one of my siblings, as I screamed like a banshee for my dad and had him check around in the bathroom. There was no one there. I have plenty more stories like this to share, but they would be incredibly repetitive. Instead, just know that this is generally what my childhood was like, filled with feelings like I wasn't alone when I physically was, and every so often, it would transcend into the physical world, like the covers flying off my bed. I know it sounds crazy, perhaps like something written up in a cheesy B-rated horror movie. But I'm not the kind of guy to lie, especially when trying to share something so personal. No. The main story happened when I was 20. There was one major event that happened, but that's a story for another time. My girlfriend at the time and I went up to North Carolina to visit my sister, who had recently moved into a house that was over 100 years old. It was very cool, and I could definitely see the attraction. The first thing I did while I was there, which was separate from my girlfriend, because I remember being upstairs and exploring the rooms with no one in there. I always do this when I go to a new place. I love to explore. In one of the rooms upstairs, there was a closet that had stairs. They seemingly went to an attic. There were cobwebs everywhere. I remember being excited to check it out, but as I ascended each step, I felt like something was stopping me. A feeling that said, "No, you can't go up here." So I stopped with a weird feeling, shook it off and went back downstairs to join my girlfriend and the family. That night, they gave us one of the guest rooms to sleep in. My girlfriend and I fell asleep pretty quickly, because we had been driving all day. I can't confirm what time it was, because when I was awoken in the middle of the night, I did not check my watch. I just know that it was pitch black outside, and both my girlfriend and I had woken up at the exact same time with no reason that we could find, except that the temperature in the room dropped. It went from a cool night to very cold in less than a minute. As we were asking each other why we were awake, the doors that were right next to the bed that led to the hallway began shaking violently. Not only that, but the doorknob was rattling and turning as if someone was desperately trying to get into the room. My girlfriend and I sat frozen in the bed until the event stopped. Wanting to be the tough boyfriend, I said that I would get up, just to check to make sure it wasn't one of my nephews playing a joke. I opened the door and saw no one. I slowly crept into the hallway down the hall and checked each room one by one. I know my sister and her husband wouldn't have done it. That would be absurd. They were in their late 30s and are not the joking type. I found my way to my two nephews' room, and not only peeked but slowly walked in and gave them a poke to be absolutely positive they weren't awake. When they both groggily looked at me, I knew that no one had been joking around with us. I made my way back to the room, told my girlfriend everyone was asleep, and we tried our best to forget about it. At this point I pondered if this could have had possibly anything to do with trying to get into the attic. When I thought back, the cobwebs were odd. I was the first one to try and go up there in a long time, it seemed. I have no idea how after being woken up like that, but we eventually managed to fall back asleep. Then, terrifyingly, it happened again. Exactly as before. My girlfriend and I both woke up, the temperature dropped, then cue the door shaking violently and the doorknob turning. We were horrified, but just as before, I got out of bed and checked every room where people were sleeping. We must have fallen back asleep. The next morning I went downstairs and immediately pulled my sister aside and told her what happened. She laughed and thought it was crazy. People always do. No one ever believes me. Least of all my family. I wanted to share this with all of you, to see what you guys made of it. Honestly, I'm a bit nervous. I've never shared anything like this, but I'd like for you to know that it is entirely true, and any information you can have would be greatly appreciated. This is a story about an incident that happened in my village of Rajasthan in Sikar, India. It was at my sister's wedding. Me and all my family live in Mumbai, but we often visit our village during our vacations every year. So it was my sister's wedding in my village, and my whole family went in order to celebrate it. The first thing you need to know about the house in the village is that it's one story. On the ground floor there are 4 rooms, kitchen, bathroom, toilet, and next to the toilet there's a staircase that leads to the first floor. On the first floor there are only 2 rooms and a veranda, or you can call it a big balcony, and a staircase leading to the terrace of the house. So all my joint family were living in the house to celebrate my sister's wedding. The night we reached home in the village, I was tired, and my family were assigned their rooms to sleep. Me, my uncle, and my cousins were sleeping on the first floor veranda on the first night. I was so tired I tried to sleep peacefully, and on the second night we all went to bed a little late. In the middle of the night, I woke up because I needed to pee. When I woke up, I saw my grandmother standing and leaning down from the wall of the veranda, and I felt a little bit weird, because my grandmother was sleeping in the ground floor. What was she doing on the first at 2 a.m? When she saw me, she started walking downstairs and I followed her. She took a left and went towards the toilet. I was also heading in that direction and saw the light on within it. I waited outside, thinking she had just closed the door before I reached it. But after waiting approximately 5 minutes, I decided to check the room my grandmother was supposed to be sleeping in. That's when I saw her sleeping peacefully. When I opened the door of the toilet, there was no one in there. At the time, I was feeling very sleepy and tried not to pay too much attention to it. I went inside the toilet and answered the call of nature and then returned to the veranda to sleep. In the morning, when I asked my grandmother what she was doing on the first floor at night, she replied that yesterday night she never went to the first floor. She then went on to say that there is a jinn living on the terrace of the house. When I shared these stories with my father, he confirmed that there is indeed a jinn. But he also said that after the renovations of the house there isn't a trace of it. My father then added that when they were very small, they always heard that someone was walking on the staircase drinking water from a pot, but the jinn never harmed anyone. And my father also told me the story of my aunt. He said that when my aunt came into the house as a new bride, she saw these jinn in the form of her new husband. At the time, my uncle was living in Dubai, so she was very scared and went to some mullah to ask for help. Mullah came and blessed the house and went that night when my aunt had a dream. In the dream, she saw a man with a beard and his face was half burned, and the man said that he will never let my aunt stay in the house. After the incident, my aunt slept in our house and always felt as if someone was shaking her toes, and she would always fall ill. Even some of her children fall ill if they stay in the house. And later my uncle built a separate house away from ours. Jinn are one of two types, evil or good. I came to know that that jinn, the one that was living in my house, was good and would never harm us nor my aunt, but just wanted her to stay away for some reason. I've always been able to interact with the unseen. I first found out I was able to interact with spirits when I was 6. I was attending a funeral and spent the day playing with my cousin. It was his funeral I was attending. Eventually, I bumped into him, and it was as if I bumped into a living person. It was like I could physically touch him. I even fell to the ground. Now, I've heard of people who could see, hear, and sense the spirits, even going as far as to communicate with them pretty regularly. But up until recently, I've never come across anyone that could physically touch them the way I can. Fast forward 18 years. I now have a 4-year-old son, and I'm running a very small spiritual business looking to expand and have grown to a position of some standing within my religion. My son is, and always has been, the light of my life. But I've always wished he had gotten the chance to meet my father, who passed away almost a full year before he was born. Now, onto the experience. I'm sitting in my mother's living room, reading while my son is coloring. Now, like I've said, I've always seen spirits, so needless to say, Dad isn't truly gone for me. I've been able to cope with his passing slowly, since I can still see and communicate with him often. One thing my dad used to do was flick my ear when I was doing something and tuning the world out. As my son was colouring, Dad kept telling me to flick his ear. I'm trying not to respond verbally because it scares Mum, and she hasn't fully coped with my father's passing. And that's when it happened. My son jumps up and stomps his foot on the ground. "No, Papa!" My mum blew a gasket. She goes on a rant at how I passed my curse onto her grandchild and that now he won't have a chance in this world. But I won't go into all of the negativity as it isn't healthy. The thing that got me was that my son knew to call my dad Papa. He's never met my sister's daughter, the only other person who knew to call Dad Papa. So this is 100% proof, to me at least, that my son was legitimately reacting to my father. My mum may be scared and she has her reasons, but I couldn't be more proud and thought that I would just share this with all of you. I was about 12 or 13 years old and was living in a Swedish town where there are forests between every block. These experiences all started when me and a few friends decided to explore a small forest in the middle of the night. We walked into the forest and we got pretty far, where I saw a white figure on all fours run down a ditch, and then my friends started to scream and run back. When we regrouped, my friends both said they saw what seemed to be a silhouette of a 6-foot man with a club about 2 feet away from our group appear out of nowhere. And the odd part is that my friends were synchronized while explaining that man's details, but we brushed it off, not realizing that next to the forest was a cemetery, and that the silhouette was probably a ghost from there. The next experience was at 5 p.m, but since we're in Sweden, it's winter, it's still very dark. I left the bus station and began walking home. The weather was fine. There wasn't any rain or fog, but when I was walking across the road from my apartment, it got very foggy, and there was a slight drizzle. When I look at the middle of the road, and to my left, I saw a silhouette of a woman in the fog. But of course, she wasn't there. The final experience is the one that scared me the most, since I was very awake and it was in my own home. Just for context, my room is located to a dining room, which is then connected to my parents' bedroom, meaning that if I opened my door, my parents' bedroom would be directly in front of me. It was 8 p.m. and I was home alone. I got hungry, so I decided to get some food that my mum left out for me in the dining room. And when I went out to unwrap my food, I saw some movement in my peripheral vision and realized that my parents' bedroom door was wide open, and for no reason whatsoever, I just stopped unwrapping my burger and just stared into the darkness. And after what felt like minutes, a white, generic, transparent 7-year-old boy rushed out from the corner of the room and was now in the doorway, but my vision blurred out the things surrounding me and zoomed in on what should have been the boy's eyes, but I could see right through them into my parents' room. My instinct kicked in and I decided that feeling is more viable an option, and I ran into my room and waited the 2 hours until my parents got home. My mother-in-law was a very funny and cool woman. She and my wife were really close, and sadly she passed away when our son was about 4 months old. Fast forward a few years, we live in an old 1930s era craftsman house in Pasadena, and our son is 3. I was giving him a bath one night, and he starts looking over my shoulder, not at random stuff, but at something. A moment passes and he asks me why Grandma calls Mummy a funny name. Long pause. I asked him what he meant, thinking he was talking about my mum. He then says, "Why does Grandma call Mummy Chi-Chi?" My mother-in-law's nickname for my wife. I was really set back by this. My wife and I never used the nickname. It was just what her mum used to call her since she was a baby. I asked him where he heard that, and his reply was, "The farmer told me." I asked him who the farmer was, and he replied, "His friend." I tell my wife this story later, and she of course is reduced to tears over the whole nickname thing. We both know there's no way for him to know this, and we just kind of marvel at it. Fast forward to the next weekend and my son is playing in his room. My wife is at work and I am at home. I hear him start talking like he's having a conversation. He's saying things like, yes, no, I don't know that. Then some laughing. And I go into his room and ask him what he's doing and he says, playing. With who? The farmer. At this point, I'm thinking about the Exorcist movie and Captain Howdy. It's a little unsettling. I ask him where the farmer is, and he says he left when I came in. Okay, now I'm getting creeped out. So my wife gets home and I tell her this, and now she's as weirded out as I am, and we have no idea what to do and figure if it happens again we'll do something. A few days later in the middle of the night, we both overhear our son saying the following. Grandma says you and I can't be friends anymore. Wife and I both go to check on him, both of us a little freaked. He's just sitting up in bed and I ask him if he's okay, and he says, yeah, Grandma says I can't play with the farmer anymore. He never once mentioned the farmer again. Not ever. He's 13 now and doesn't remember any of this, but we do. My deceased mother-in-law prevented a full-on exorcist, like the thing in our home. I would like to preface this story by saying that I am not an expert in the paranormal. At best, I'm just a guy with an interest, shining some light on the unknown. Today at work, one of my co-workers told me a story of a paranormal experience she had. For the life of me, I don't know what to make of it. It sounded like something out of a book, but I know her. She wasn't making this up. And I'm sharing this with all of you to see if any of you can shed some light or have had anything similar happen to you. For context, I have developed a reputation at work for telling stories. Today I was telling a couple of co-workers a story about a college professor of mine who on the first day of class claimed to have had a paranormal experience. Naturally, my classmates and I were fascinated and asked him to elaborate. He said he would explain the whole thing on the last day of class. He did, but it ended up being a huge letdown. Just a perfectly horizontal strand of thread floating across the room while he was vacuuming. After I finished the story, one of my co-workers, an older Hispanic lady, said, I had a paranormal experience once. I didn't expect much, but asked her what had happened. He went on to explain as a kid, her mum had dragged her to see fortune tellers. On one occasion, the fortune teller told her that someone would try to take her to the beach to drown her. She didn't think much of it at the time. Years later, she's working in a daycare in Florida. One day, the daycare hired a new employee, a lady who, like my co-worker, made extra money on the side cleaning houses. My co-worker didn't really describe her, but emphasized that she always felt there was something off about this person. Maybe that's hindsight bias, maybe not. I'm unsure. This lady frequently asked her to go to the beach with her, but my co-worker refused each time, presumably because of the fortune teller's warning. One day, a lady asked my co-worker to come over to her house to discuss their house cleaning work. I'm not sure what they were supposed to discuss about it, but my co-worker agreed. The lady gave her an address, and my co-worker drove there on that specified day. She explained, as soon as she entered this person's house, it became clear that the lady was evil. But the only thing she described in the house was a shrine in the bedroom. There was a ceramic genie from Aladdin on the table in the corner of the bedroom, which was surrounded by candles, incense, and other things. Naturally, this confused me. I made a joke that was something akin to, did witches get their stuff from Disney stores in the mall in those days? She didn't explain further. She just said it was the genie from Aladdin. Now let me be clear. I think my co-worker was being honest. She wasn't joking around. I could tell this story legitimately had her on edge. But that being said, I also think she probably mistook the ceramic thing to be Genie. My gut instinct is telling me that it looked similar, and without a frame of reference to explain what it really was, her memory perhaps just latched onto the closest thing it could associate with, the Genie. What it really was, though, I have no idea. The lady told her it was a spirit god. Then the lady sat down on the edge of her bed, motioned for my co-worker to join her, and held out her hand. Now at this point, still hung up on the whole genie thing, I joked that she probably said, "Let me take you on a magic carpet ride." My co-worker looked at me, not recognizing the joke as such, and said, totally serious, "That's exactly what she said." My co-worker took the woman's hand. The woman somehow led her without moving from the edge of the bed to a specific location in New York City. I'm not entirely sure if the woman just described the trip there and my co-worker's mind visualized it, or if she legitimately saw the place, but she made it sound like she at least felt like she was really there. The woman explained that they were where her ex-husband lived. They went to his apartment, knocked on the door, and no one answered, so the woman broke down the door and they entered. The woman explained that she wanted to burn it down with the guy still in it, so she lit a match and dropped it, which caused the room to catch fire. Oddly enough, my co-worker explained the fire seemed to remain contained to just the room, and I have no explanation for this, and it seemed to confuse her too. My co-worker says that she still felt the heat from the fire, and at that point decided she didn't want anything else to do with this whole ordeal. She somehow ended it and found herself back in the room in Florida. Presumably, she let go of the woman's hand but didn't say and didn't hear me ask how she got back. She then ran back to her car as quickly as possible and drove away. She didn't say anything about whether or not the lady was still in the room when she came to, but I will try and find that out. But then things got even weirder. The lady never returned to work. When my co-worker asked for information on what happened to the woman, the employers didn't even know who the co-worker was talking about. They hadn't hired anyone new recently. My co-worker tried calling this woman but couldn't get through, and when she returned to the house, she found a vacant lot. I asked her to pinpoint the date this happened and asked if she remembered which building she had seen in New York, with intent to Google the date, the location, and the fire just for kicks, but she couldn't remember that. The story is unbelievable, I know. Yet, while I doubt some of the details of my co-worker's memory, I do not doubt that she had a genuine experience, and that the broad strokes of this event actually did happen. As I said before, I'm on here because I'm curious to see if anyone else has ever experienced anything similar. This isn't my area of expertise. This was the first time I'd heard something this outlandish from a source I trust. So, what are your thoughts? My daughter recently turned 3, and we went up to my in-laws. They live near the border with Poland. We named our daughter after my wife's grandmother, an amazing lady who passed right before we found out about our pregnancy. My daughter's name is Emma Rose, Emma being the first name and Rose being her middle name, which is something unique to our family, as generally speaking Ukrainians don't do middle names. So my grandmother-in-law would have been Baba Emma to my wife growing up, and that's how we have always talked about her and referred to her as Baba Emma. Keep in mind my daughter is old enough to know her own name now, so you say, "Who are you?" or some variation of "What's your name?" and she'll say Emma Rose. After the long 6-hour drive, we reach the village. On the way into the village, of course, we pass the cemetery where Baba Emma is buried. This particular time we had my mother-in-law in the car with us, as we picked her up from town on the way to the village. And she's in the back playing with little Emma. Emma is ecstatic, because she hasn't seen her grandma in a while and was really missing her lately. Grandma felt the same about Emma. So we're slowly driving because the roads are terrible. And as we pass the cemetery, Emma Rose breaks away from her grandma, points to the window and says, "Look!" What is it, Emma? What do you see? "It's Emma Rose." "No, you're Emma Rose." "No, there, Emma Rose." Okay, my daughter just saw herself. Alright then. My wife and I look at each other, smirk, and just keep moving. I've read online about many creepy things that toddlers say, but this was the first. I guess it all starts at 3. I've never had much in the way of paranormal experiences. A couple of things in my childhood were strange, like once I heard the TV on in the middle of the night, loudly playing a certain movie I recognized, only to get up and find no one there. The TV and the house dark and quiet. I always just explained these weird occurrences as me dreaming or being half asleep. There is one occurrence, however, that I cannot explain away. I know I was wide awake, and I remember it clearly. I was 14 at the time, very level-headed, and I wasn't prone to weird dreams or crazy imagination. Weeks prior, I'd had an intense spiritual experience in my life, and I think that because of the experience, I was closer to the spiritual world than normal. That's how I've always explained that anyway. My sister had moved out of our house that year to go to college, but her new place was in town, so I went over there frequently to hang out or spend the night. We were very close. I always slept on the small couch bed when I stayed over, and I had a direct view into her bedroom. Once after staying the night, I woke up in the morning with a strange feeling of dread. I laid there awake for about 30 minutes, just waiting for my sister to get up so that I could eat breakfast. I felt very uneasy and afraid being the only one awake in the house. At one point I felt compelled to look over at her bedroom. I had the weirdest feeling that if I did, I would see something there. I reluctantly turned my head and gasped. There, right next to her bed, watching her sleep, was a little man. This little man must have heard me gasp because he turned to look at me. I remember he was kind of chubby with his head oddly shaped, especially in the forehead area. It looked like he had had 2 large lumps on his forehead. His pupils were black and piercing. His hands were on the edge of the mattress as if to hold himself up. Because he was so short, he was standing on tiptoes to look at her. I don't remember what he was wearing or anything else about him. As soon as he saw me, he ran out of sight. I was terrified and laid there with my scalp tingling, frozen in terror. My sister didn't wake up for another hour or so, and I started thinking that maybe someone had broken into the house, so I eventually gathered my courage and tiptoed into her room to look in the direction I'd seen the little man run. Nothing was there. I searched the whole house but couldn't find him. This experience scared me so badly, I couldn't tell my sister what I had seen. I was worried I'd freak her out by telling her that a little man had been watching her sleep. I didn't know why he had been there watching her so intensely. Finally, in my early 20s, I got the nerve to tell her what I'd seen. She brushed it off like it wasn't important or frightening. I'm not sure she believed me. Nothing else weird ever happened in that house. Nothing else weird ever happened to me either. I'm a Chickasaw Native American, and I've heard some stories about the little people. They are a lot like fairies, I guess. Supposedly they hang out in the woods and sometimes appear to people who are destined to become doctors or healers. Neither my sister or I have anything to do with medicine. I'm a teacher, and she's a stay-at-home mum. However, that is the closest thing I've heard of that matches what I saw that day. While getting ready for work this morning, I remembered I needed to go into our attic and count a few things for some renovation work I'm doing in our house. We have a pull-down attic access that's located in the ceiling of our main hallway and is almost directly above the bathroom door. My wife was in the bathroom applying makeup in front of the sink, while my 22-month-old daughter was sitting on the bathroom counter, just 6 inches away from my wife, playing with her toothbrush when I heard my daughter say, "Hi," which I thought she was directing the hi to my wife, which is something she does a lot, so I thought nothing of it. Why she has that face, and she says, "When you got to the attic, Quinn looked up and said hi." When I looked at her to say hi back, I noticed she was looking at the wall that would be directly behind me, and said hi again. Then, slowly, lifted her head up as if she was watching someone walk closer to her, then tucked her arm into her side and giggled. This is what she does when she's protecting herself from tickles. My wife asked my daughter who she was talking to. My daughter didn't say anything back, but just at that moment the plastic makeup container my wife was holding closed as if it was slapped shut. By this time in the story, I had come down from the attic and entered the bathroom, not seeing anything happen with my own eyes, but I did hear the conversation my wife and daughter had. This is the first ever experience my wife or I have had since we were living in our house of 4 years, besides some odd giggling and random pointing that my daughter has done throughout the past year. Like I said, nothing wild, but definitely made an impact on my wife, who isn't an "I believe in ghosts" type of person, and usually calls bull on any of the stories. We'll have to see what happens next. A while back, I was chosen to be in an indie film about jinns, basically the local version of demons. Before I continue, there are 4 things you should know about them. 1. It is said they can take the form of animals and humans with circular eyes, literally circles for eyes. 2. They're supposedly born from smokeless fire. 3. They feed on energy, such as the energy you use to stay awake and the energy you use to power electronics. And 4. There are Christian jinn, Muslim jinn, you name it. They have their own free will, so everyone is different. Some are very nice, while others not so much. Now for the tale. We were filming in the desert, and a series of events started happening. Right when we arrived, there was instantly a presence of something there. Then a knife, bent, twisted with red marks, started appearing at my feet. Every 15 meters or so, constantly, for the entire time I was in the desert, this knife would follow me. 4 or so nights into filming, right as we were packing up, a loud screech could be heard. It was sort of a mix between a falcon, a wolf, and a mountain lion. It was later revealed to us by an expert of desert animals that there were no animals in the desert that made that sort of noise. On the 5th night, things started to get interesting. At one point we were sitting down taking a break when the sand just started to smoke. We thought maybe a small plant had combusted from the heat, and after a minute or two the smoke stopped. We checked and there was no plant, so we all sat back down, and the second our butts hit the seat, boom, all the sand all around the smoking area and where the smoke had been burst into flames with no reason as to how or why. Then after that, all our cameras started to drain of battery power very, very quickly. This is frightening because 1, it meant we had to stay there longer, and 2, as mentioned in number 3, they feed on energy. The next night, albino scorpions, which are extremely rare, started sprinting towards the actors, literally going at full speed. We were forced to kill these rare creatures by burning them with a torch, and every time one died, 2 more would replace it. Literally 2 more would come out of nowhere full speed. This continued for several minutes, and things like this kept happening for the entire 2 weeks or so we were at the site. When we finished filming, we split up for a bit to let the director edit some of the stuff. Then we had to film parts at a house. It's important here to mention that the movie was called 3 AM. We were talking and one of the actors stated that since we had split up, he had woken up at 3 AM every morning, his dogs going crazy and his alarm clock going off, and his AC set itself to 3 degrees. 2 of the other actors were relieved, as the same thing had been happening to them. At the same time, I had never felt alone while I was in my room at night, and constantly felt like something was watching us. I guess it followed us home. Since then we have finished the film. I started praying for protection every night, based off events that have happened, and the actor who originally had the alarm go off at 3 a.m. moved to a new house. Another actor moved to Canada. We were actually filming in the United Arab Emirates, which is in the Middle East, so it's pretty far. The second actor moved internationally, and I am leaving in about 4 weeks. I'm just hoping it doesn't follow me home again. I really wish I had some answers. These events occurred in my home, which is in the suburbs next to a major highway. When my older brother was 3 to 4, he slept in his room, that is on the back corner of my house, so 2 walls lead to the outside. He was in this room when he heard a sound above him, either in the attic or the roof, then another one on the other side of the wall that leads to the backyard, and then one further away from the wall. All of this occurred within a span of 5 to 7 seconds, so whatever it was moving fast, or there were 3 of them. Confused, he went to the living room to tell my mum, to which she asked what the sound was like. "Like a low whistle," he said. My mum didn't think much of it and told him it was probably an owl that swooped by. This happened around 1999. Well, 19 years later, my room is in the opposite end of the house than my brother's, and is basically running along the side of the house from the front to back, with a long window that goes across. I keep it covered with curtains though. The path outside of my room that leads to the backyard is closed by a big gate that makes a noise when you slide it open, and a tall wooden fence divides me and my neighbor's property. The bed I sleep in is right up against the windowed wall, and my desk is on the other side of the room next to my door. My room door leads to the kitchen, which has a sliding door that leads to an unfinished room that only has a floor and a roof and is open to the elements. The fact this was unfinished means the wooden floor was suspended by stones, making it difficult to traverse without making a sound, as it's basically hollow. This information is important for later. My mum, my brother and I were in my room telling creepy experiences we've had. Keep in mind this was around 1 a.m. I was sitting on my bed and my mum was on the chair in front of the desk, and my brother was at the doorway of my room. We're facing each other in a triangle formation telling the stories. My brother's story about the whistling came up, and I found it intriguing, so I queried him about it. The conversation went something like this. "Wait, so you heard a whistling sound?" "Yeah, it's the best I can describe it from what I can remember." "So it's like this?" "Yeah, kinda." At this point we were interrupted by a low whistle sound identical to mine coming from the direction of the noise gate, which also happened to be behind where my mum was facing. My mum and I look in the direction of it, though we couldn't see whatever was causing it. We looked at each other with a look of, "You heard that too, right?" My brother didn't hear, so we explained to him what happened, and he had a ponderous face. We found it strange, but brushed it off to a dog with an incredible sense of coincidence. The thought that it sounded like me bothered me, but again, surely it was a coincidence. But it wasn't long until that secure thought would be crushed, like crisps under bison. We had moved on to a different tale when we all heard the exact same whistle again. This time it was right behind me, on the other side of the window and in my property. The only way to get there was to open the noisy gate or climb over the neighbor's fence. I didn't dare look outside, and we were all baffled. We all agreed that it was creepy, but surely it was the final time we would hear it. The same thing happened, where time passed before hearing it again, yet this time behind my brother, which would be in the unfinished room next to our sliding door, which was probably unlocked. How could they have gotten there without making a single sound? Even when stepping cautiously, it's near impossible to be quiet while stepping on the wood, especially with someone who's completely unfamiliar to the layout of the house. We heard it a fourth and final time at the original spot near the gate, and at this point we were so shaken as to what it was. First, it appears as a coincidence, then it mimicked me. It traversed around my house without making a sound and lastly whistled only when it was directly behind one of us. It wasn't long before we called it a night, and I had to sleep in that room with the thing mocking me. My parents had previously slept in that room for years before I did, and they never heard anything like that. And I haven't heard it before or since that day. I still ask my brother and mum about it once in a while just to confirm that it did happen. It always gives me the chills just thinking about it. Our son knew all sorts of oddball things for his age. At 3, he asked grown-up questions, like asking his doctor how he could build an otoscope because he might be able to see people's thoughts with it. And this farmer's thing was just odd beyond belief. One day I saw him walking around with his hands out talking to it. I asked him what he was doing, and he said something about carrying the farmer because he was tired. He once mentioned my wife's dead uncle, who died in Vietnam, to my wife in passing. He just said, "Do you know Uncle Andrew died and got a medal?" Just things he wouldn't know. My wife also never really talked about her uncle because she never really knew him, and her dad never brought it up. All in, this farmer nonsense went on for many weeks on and off, and it was very creepy. When I was young and in year 5 of primary school, I saw a man named Alex. He didn't tell me his name, but I named him after the Minecraft character, because that was a game I played constantly at the time. He was older than me, maybe early 20s, and had somewhat of a gravelly voice, kind of like he'd been yelling for 5 minutes just before talking. He wore a leather jacket, cargo shorts, and occasionally I would tell him how they didn't suit his jacket, which he would just respond with, "Well, I didn't choose them." Now, he didn't start talking to me until the last 2 years that I saw him, but before then he would just do things, and I would follow entranced. When I saw him first, I was terrified. He was on the balcony, so I told my mum and dad. They then went to see if they could see him and couldn't. I was then booked to see a psychologist for the duration of the time I lived in the town. Alex followed me everywhere. Well, I say followed, but I mean he was in the same places as me. More often than not, he would just be doing his own thing, but still be within my line of sight. He liked to walk into my mum's room when she was tucking me into bed. After I told her about this, she hired a lady to spiritually clean the house, and Alex was gone for a week. I felt quite lost without him. Keep in mind, I was heavily bullied and only had one other friend who for a while pretended to see Alex, which really made me happy. But he didn't like her. He came back after a week and expressed his anger at not being able to join me at school and home. We were very angry at Mum for a little while. I never asked Alex about his past life. He said he had one and mentioned it a few times, but when he did, it kind of faded away for a bit and then went right back to pretending he didn't remember. Now, remember how I said I went to a psychologist? Well, this dude was sketchy as hell. He made me sign all these documents every day. I had no idea what they said or did, but he gave me Mentos after every one, so I was happy. He told me Alex was a ghost and it was perfectly okay to see him. He said I had a gift, and many of his other clients did. Sometimes Alex would come in there with me, and the psychologist would ask him to move something. Alex liked to tell me to yell at the dude to go something himself. I was in year 6 when this incident happened, and I didn't realize what it meant. After 4 years of seeing Alex, I moved states. The bullying had become so bad that I was actively trying to harm myself. I haven't seen him since I moved. It's been about 3.5 years. I miss him sometimes, and he was a massive support for me. I just wonder if anyone has had a similar experience. I don't think I've forgotten anything, but I would be happy to explain if anyone wanted more info. The first paranormal thing I ever experienced started when I was 2.5, just before Christmas of 1990, and ended a year and a half later on my 4th birthday. Some of the stories involved in these events I have been told back to me by my own family, but the memories that are truly vivid I know only to be mine, since I was the only person who could actually see the 2 ghosts. At the time of this, I lived with my father's mother. My parents lived with us too, but worked so much I hardly ever saw them except at bedtime, if they made it. I spent most of my time playing by myself in a large playroom. The room was empty mostly, with a few toys here and there scattered about. No rug, no carpet, no furniture, just one big window. I was facing the snow out the window as I used my wooden blocks to construct a towering, structurally dangerous ziggurat of primary colors when I suddenly wasn't building it alone. On the other side of the tower sat a girl of around 16 with strawberry blonde hair in 2 plaits, a ton of freckles and pale skin, wearing denim overalls and a faded t-shirt striped in yellow and green. She looked solid to me, but glowed from the inside out. White brightness. It didn't even seem odd that she was there at the time. I didn't even speak to her during this visit. When I spotted her, we smiled at each other. When she was done helping me with my creation, she was gone. But it wasn't the last time I'd see her. She became a frequent companion when I was left alone to play. I learned her name was Sharon. She said that she was there to watch me, so I called her my babysitter. I talked to her about my family and they all thought she was an imaginary friend. Despite her wild glow, she was the first ghost-type person I'd ever met, so I didn't realize that she wasn't just another human. I introduced her to my mom one weekend and my mother explained that she couldn't see Sharon at all, and I said, "But she's right here." And Sharon said I was the only person who could see her. Things were nice for a long time. That summer, spring, and most of the following fall were lovely. Finally, I had a day-to-day companion willing to tolerate any silly things I felt like doing. Once, she stopped me from drowning in the creek behind the house. I didn't tell my parents that they had pointed out multiple times that they didn't think she should be real. They wouldn't understand. The following Halloween, I met another being. She never told me her name, but Sharon called her the Vexo Lady. She was a tall, beautiful woman of about 50, beautiful and cold. Her eyes were an unnaturally bright blue. She wore bright red lipstick and had short, white hair. She wore a tightly and fairly short, black cocktail dress with long sleeves and no shoulders, and tall black heels. She glowed in a similar way to Sharon, but while Sharon was like the bright warmth of a midday sun in summer, the lady was like the sun glinting off ice in the winter, a sharp and unpleasant blinding glare. I knew from the moment we met that I could never trust a word she said. She was nice in the ways adults are fakely nice to children that they think are stupid. Everything about her felt dangerous and cutting. We met after I went to bed that Halloween. She came into my room like I'd kept her waiting for an appointment and told me that she had some place she wanted to show me. Someplace beautiful. A huge meadow full of soft grass and sweet flowers, full of children, special children like me. I told her I couldn't go because it was time for me to go to bed. She was annoyed, but I rolled over and stared at the wall and ignored her with all my might, as she stalked around and huffed and clicked her shoes. Eventually I fell asleep, and she wasn't there when I woke up the next morning. After this I started seeing more and more ghosts. A little boy in the house, an old man in the woods, strange figures everywhere we went. I told my parents about all of this, and along with some other stories as well. Things like floating down a staircase, finding human bones in the backyard, and communicating with a weird doll that's been in our family for a while. My parents, as they told me many years later, were getting freaked the hell out. The weirdest part that they explained was that a 3-year-old shouldn't know the word vex meant bother, and the Vexo Lady was called that because she always bothered me and Sharon. They had no clue where I'd learnt it, and said that it was the beginning of them convincing them something odd was happening. This all kept up until the night before my 4th birthday. I slept in a small nursery off my parents' bedroom. I was awoken in the middle of the night by the lady. She dragged me out of bed by pulling on my right arm, pulling me through my parents' bedroom and into their closet. In the wall of their closet was what I can only call a portal. It glowed blue and white around the edges of a rectangle like a welding flame. Through this strange window was a world she had described: blue sky, white clouds, lush grass, flowers almost glowing, and children running around. She said it was time for me to go. She stepped through. The colors on the other side looked far too wrong, too bright and too fake. More than my eyes could handle. My arm went through behind her as she gripped my wrist, and I planted my feet against the wall and struggled to get free. I was in up to the elbow when a pair of arms grabbed me from behind. It was Sharon. She yanked me hard and we thudded hard onto the floor of the closet. The portal cracked and closed with the lady on the other side. Sharon cuddled me in her lap, petting my long hair and hugging me close, telling me it would be all right now. She hadn't gotten me, and she couldn't. It was late, 6:30 in the morning, and I was born at 6:30. The invisible deadline she was so annoyed to be working against had passed. My parents opened the closet doors, and my mum later told me it looked like I was hovering off the floor for a moment. They couldn't see Sharon, but I was in her lap. She picked me up, as they had heard a loud thud when Sharon and I hit the floor, as it had awoken them. Sharon then waved goodbye and faded into the morning sun. I never saw her nor the lady again. This occurrence was pretty much the last straw for my parents and the driving reason for us moving out of my grandmother's house. 2 months later. It didn't help the new house was also dreadfully haunted. Keep in mind that all of this is pieced together with my now 33-year-old vocabulary and information my parents gave me after, like, "Hey, do you guys remember the Vexo lady?" when I was in my late teens. But even with every other strange thing I've since experienced in my life, this was my longest lasting, most consistent haunting. Even though I've never been sure they were ghosts. I'm pretty sure Sharon was my guardian angel, and I think the lady wanted to steal me because of my unnatural sensitivity as relatives to the paranormal. It was weird, and it was more weird because of how solidly I still recall these meetings. My sister lived in a city in Saudi Arabia. She was studying, and since we didn't live there, she lived in a condo/motel that was unofficially a dorm since all of its inhabitants were female students from other cities in Saudi Arabia, and perhaps even from other countries. She had a friend of hers join her, and they became roommates. It all began one night when they were asleep, and they liked the room to be pitch black. And out of the blue, the heavy suitcases that were on top of the cupboards fell to the floor, waking both of them up. Now, for those who say it might just fall off randomly or be caused by the wind, it was pushed to the very back of the cupboard, touching the wall that it was resting in front of. And on top of that, the cupboard had an upward frame around the top of it to secure things from falling. My sister woke up immediately and told her friend they were not alone. And since many incidents happened in our home, my sister is the one that would feel the most uncomfortable when strange and paranormal events occurred. She felt that something wasn't right. She woke up, pushed the suitcase to the side, and played from her phone some Quran verses for protection, since we're Muslim. After that, she didn't hear anything through the night. A while after that incident, she and her friend were watching TV in the living room, and they heard a loud knock on the door, and when they went to check, there was no one there. Now it might not seem weird, but their room was located last at the end of a long corridor where almost 15 rooms are lined along both sides. So for someone to knock and leave, they must be able to see the back of someone walking through the corridor as they left, so there's no way. Another incident that happened is since the very beginning, they heard thrashing, babies crying, pots and pans being struck, and a woman's voice talking in the room next to theirs. Thinking it was a student with kids, they never gave it too much attention, until the end of their stay. They asked the landlord if he could talk to the lady next door to keep it down a bit, and he said that no one had resided in that flat for many years. Also, the men at the reception told them they always saw ladies in abayas, which are long black cloths covering head to toe, usually worn in Saudi Arabia, walking around the corridors and going into flats which are locked or even empty. When they asked them, thinking that they were inhabitants, the ladies never replied or even turned around to acknowledge them. The receptionist told them that they used to keep praying mats, which are essential in Islam whenever you want to pray, besides the entrance whenever they came in the morning every day, and they'd see thick black strands of long hair the length of the praying mat. So they decided to remove them to prevent other students from asking them and being scared and leaving this place. This sister of mine had many experiences with the paranormal and always ignores them, and even sometimes she would dream of things that would happen a day or two later. I had never met my grandpa, considering the fact that he had died from a heart attack 2 or 3 years before I was born. But that didn't mean I couldn't speak to him. When I was younger, I was always on the move. When we finally settled in an apartment in West Texas, weird things began to happen. My theory is that me and my grandfather used to be friends through the paranormal. The first red flag for my parents was when they would always find me in front of my closet, seemingly talking to no one. "Who are you talking to?" they always said, assuming I had an imaginary friend. Each time in the most casual voice, I always said, "Grandpa." After that started happening, things began getting even weirder. One night at 5 p.m, my parents heard me crying. Obviously they rushed to where I was, and to their surprise, I was on the top shelf of the closet in the hallway. That closet had broken and rusted doors that were really hard to open for an adult. So how could a 2-year-old open them, much less climb that high? It had always puzzled my entire family. They for some reason had a weird idea. They thought I would be able to see my grandfather's grave for the first time, and if they did that, maybe the weird things would stop. But it got even weirder from there. When they finally took me to the cemetery, which I had never been to, I sprinted to my grandfather's grave as if I knew exactly where it was, and had done it multiple times. I looked at them with a smile on my face, as casual as ever, and said, "Here's Grandpa." How did I get on the top shelf? How did I know where his grave was? I guess they always say, children can see what we can't. This happened when I was about 10 years old. I used to live in a really small 2-bedroom home. At the time, I shared my room with my older brother, since my little brother was too small to sleep with us. This home used to be rented out by this old couple, and apparently they died there too. My mum used to tell me that she used to see the old lady and old man in their wheelchairs at night. The old couple would just stare, and after a while would smile and wave. They seemed really kind and friendly. Now, I'm partially blind and don't use glasses because they don't work for me. Because of this, I never thought I would experience anything for myself. One night, I was trying to walk to my room, and my mum forgot to put something away. So naturally I ran into it, and could clearly hear a female voice say, "Be careful," right before I ran into it. My parents were asleep. No way it was them. And the voice didn't sound like my mum's voice at all. Another time, I was going to the bathroom, which is right next to my room. The hallway where the rooms and bathrooms are is facing the living room. So this time I was facing the door to my room, and I see a shadow on the door. I started walking by but noticed that I saw it. So it stopped, waved, and then continued walking towards the kitchen. My brother and I would always tell my mum we felt our beds shaking a little at night. Not a violent shake, but enough for us to feel it. I don't think this was all caused by the elderly couple that passed away there. I think there was something else there too. And sometimes it was scary, but other times it was comforting. My sister brought this story up to me a few times, and every single time she does, I get creeped out. This happened to my sister a few years ago in our apartment. She was in my parents' room praying. We are Muslim, so my sister was wearing a headscarf and a long skirt to pray with. My parents' room has a huge mirrored closet, so my sister was praying in front of it, which is a big nope from me. So as she is praying, she hears someone open the room door behind her. While they open it, she told me that everyone that was home was in the living room. So as she bends over while praying, she hears footsteps behind her approaching. Because she's bending down, she can't see from the skirt. So as she rises up to stand, she looks at the mirror and makes a dash to the living room, not even finishing her prayers. She said that in the mirror, she saw a tall black figure behind her, which attempted to wrap its long arms around her when she stood up. She said as she ran, she looked back and still saw it in the mirror. She ran and told my dad, and told him, and he said it was nothing. Still dumbfounded, she asked him later, and he said, yeah, that was a jinn. For anyone who doesn't know what a jinn is, it's what people like to call shadow people. Another time, about a year ago, my sister said how she was laying on her bed on her phone when everyone was asleep, and she had her foot hanging out from the bed. She said how something just wrapped its hand around her foot and she froze. She didn't know what to do and just stood still, terrified of what was holding her foot. She said it started to then stroke her foot when it finally let go. I guess her jinn or ghost had a foot fetish. Anyway, I just wanted to share that with you guys. The first time I saw her, as she followed me since I was a kid, was about 5th grade. Now I'm in my 20s. I've always seen spirits or other things ever since I can remember. I've tried to look at both sides of the scientific and spiritual, and try to argue both aspects with myself, and tend to not share much info to people in fear of sounding like a wacko. I've told my sister, brother, and best friend. My buddy saw ghosts with me and now believes in ghosts, but doesn't talk to me about it anymore. I think I shook his view on the world. When I was in 5th grade, I had a friend over to stay the night and hang out. The standard sleepover when you're a kid. So we're being annoying young boys all jacked up on sugar and pop, playing the old Xbox and GameCube. Many memories there. It gets to about midnight, and we had these PVC pipe-like giant connects. I don't know if anyone remembers those, but we used to build some weird fort structures in the basement with them. My friend and I then heard my 2 cats hissing and just going nuts. So I told my friend that it was just probably raccoons or something that was pissing them off. It wasn't the first time, you see. So we run up the stairs to see if they were at the back door and the cats weren't there. Then we walk up to the front door and the cats are at the base of the stairs to the 2nd level puffed and hissing. We both look up to the top of the stairs and we both see a girl standing there with a blue hue and white clothes and dark hair. I'm assuming she's roughly our age, just standing there holding onto the railing looking down. So we ran back downstairs after looking at her a little, and we locked ourselves in the basement. My friend never came over again. Many friends refused to stay at my house claiming it was haunted, and I was labeled as the weird kid in school and no one wanted to be my friend. I've seen her for a long time, and she follows me when I move, even 150 miles. Then I moved across the country, and when I was on danger a few times. If people have theories, I'm all ears. I'm not scared to see her again, and I wish I had the video evidence to prove it. Anyway, any discussions or theories would be helpful. I'd appreciate the insight. I don't like talking about this much. It's probably one of the most trying moments of my life. But here it is. A number of years ago, I was on a road trip. I am originally from Saudi Arabia. The road trip was around neighboring countries, and me and my friend were having a blast. We're both Muslim, and have been raised and taught traditional Muslim values. One thing I don't mess with are jinns. They can be either good or bad, but it's best not to find out, at least in my opinion. It was on a very dark night, starry. I can't remember where we were going to, but it was about a 4-hour drive. We were really excited for this next part of our trip. As I was driving, my eyes were starting to get sleepy. I was getting tired. My friend had already passed out in the seat behind me, and I knew that if I carried on going, I would definitely fall asleep. So, I took a swig from my water and looked and squinted at the distance, hoping to find a hotel or something I could stay at with my friend for the night, to freshen up and leave in the morning, to finish this part of our journey. It was about a good 20 minutes before we approached any such place. It was getting dark, and right before we approached the guest house, I swear I saw something dart in front of me. My high beams were on, and whatever this thing was darker than night. It's almost like when it passed by my lights, it absorbed the light, turned it into pure darkness, and was gone. Me, being tired of course, instantly dismissed this as nothing more than a hallucination, which all it did was wake me up further and told me that I really had to get off the road. By the time I reached the guest house, my friend and I got our bare essentials and groggily dragged ourselves to the front desk, where we were assigned a room, and both went to sleep. I was passing out on the bed. My nightly ritual of freshening up before bed had slightly woken me up, which was frustrating as I really needed the sleep. Tossing and turning in my small bed, I look out the window, where I see lights dazzling through the thinly veiled curtains. Thinking to myself about all the places I'm going to see tomorrow, I try shutting my eyes to make the most of time. Then I remember. Did I set my alarm? I reach over to the little side table and grab my phone, flick it on and check the alarm app. It was set. I plug it in again and try to close my eyes. But then something, a thought, entered my brain. The jinn. Why was I thinking that? It wasn't a jinn that crossed my path earlier, surely not. Simply a hallucination or a shadow, I was telling myself. But could it have been something more? I was unsure, but freaked out. I started to sweat and tried telling myself it couldn't have been. I ended up falling asleep and had the most horrific nightmares. I was in a dark, deserted room, filled with smoke, and being chased by creatures made of fire. I woke up screaming, My friend standing by my bedside asking if I was okay. In panicked and labored breaths, I asked if he saw something on our drive, but he shook his head. I told him not to worry about it and tried to fall back asleep, but the fear that I was feeling from the dream had persisted into reality. I looked around the room, but there was nothing. But this feeling of ominous danger kept up the entire night. I hardly slept a wink. I was blinking mostly, closing my eyes and opening them again religiously. I knew there was something out there. It didn't want me here, and it was making that abundantly clear. I really just wanted to leave. After the many painstaking hours and lack of sleep, 6:30 a.m. finally rolled around, and my friend, awoken by my alarm, got up. He asked how I slept, but he could tell by the look in my eyes that my answer was, I didn't. He decided he'd be the driver for this next part of the journey, and as we were just paying our fee at the little guest house, the guy asked if we had enjoyed our stay. I gave him a courteous nod, even though this wasn't necessarily true. But my friend, a lot more plucky than I, reached out to him and asked if he had experienced anything strange in the hotel before. He gave us a quizzical and worrying look before saying, "You didn't hear it from me. I've only worked here a while, but I've been told there are jinn nearby, and some that can be unfriendly." That was enough for me. We got into the car, and I knew it was a jinn that had been terrorizing me that night. I'm so glad we got out of there. All that I hope for is that it didn't follow me, because I don't think if I'll ever be able to sleep again if it does. My family owns a whole building in Poland. My great-grandfather bought the building for cents when times were harsh, and shortly before the Second World War started, so it's pretty old. This happened around 1998. I was 2 at the time, and I was a pretty lonely child, although I had an older brother. He didn't really like me because I didn't share his interest in soccer at the time. My father was an arse and wasn't around much, and my mum had her own store next to our home, and she didn't have much time either. I used to pass hours in my room just playing alone with my Lego. The babysitter was in the next room doing her own thing, and I remember one day while playing alone, there was a kid sitting on the other side of the Lego pile who was dressed strangely and was quiet, but I didn't mind. I finally had some company. I don't know why I didn't tell the mum or babysitter. Maybe it's because I didn't want to get into trouble. Well, there I was playing with the kid, talking to him and asking him to pass me certain Lego bits that were on his side of the pile. This was going on for the next 2 years until we moved to another apartment because of a flood affecting us. Fast forward to when I was 16. I went to see my grandfather. He was my great-grandfather's son, the one who bought the building. We got on the topic of the building complex and all the legal parts, etc., as during the last 50 years, the situation of who owned what part got pretty complicated. My grandfather went for an old file book with documents and pictures and started showing it to me and my brother. As we were going through the pictures, I pointed to a family picture. I pointed to a kid and said, "Hey, I know him." My grandfather stopped and looked at me surprised. "You know him?" "Yeah, I used to play with him when I was small." Now he looked even more shocked. "How is it possible you were playing with him if he died during the war when the Nazis entered the building and killed all the Jewish families?" I then noticed the Star of David on the kid's chest, and it hit me afterwards that I was playing with a long-gone child. I started talking to him and then my mum, and both told me it's common for people in my family to have certain abilities and be able to communicate with those that are past. I tried to call him the last time I was there, but either he's gone or doesn't want to show up. I'm thinking about buying a set of Legos and starting to play next time I'm there, just to see if I can see him one last time. I haven't noticed until a year ago, when during the summer I had horrible sleep paralysis, where a dark, abnormal, tall silhouette with bright white teeth was standing on my bed. Keep in mind it was bent over from being too tall, and this isn't an exaggeration. There have been multiple things that have happened in my life that I'm not too much concerned to, as they don't tie with anything. But when I was younger in the night, I would always hear thumps coming from the attic above my room. There is a wooden entrance, in fact, to the attic, and the attic is tall enough to crawl into. I was creeped out by it and one day asked my dad to look in there. There was absolutely nothing, and the thumps stopped. Then they happened in the walls. It's been less frequent as of late. I believe I also have a ghost cat in this house in which we reside. You can sometimes feel it walking across the bed and laying on a part of your body. It seems docile enough. When I'm alone, in the woods behind our house, I'll hear noises that can range from being an animal that's not nearby to this loud guttural growling. I recently acknowledged the beings and told them to leave us in peace, but they seem to be more active now. 3 days ago, I jokingly said that my brother's car was possessed because of the constant tapping and ticking sounds were happening along with the radio acting odd. Later that day, we almost crashed coming home from church. All I remember hearing before the crash was something that sounded like a chain rubbing against metal at 60 miles an hour. The next night I awoke at 3 a.m. It's dumb because it's always 3. I voiced something along those lines and then went back to sleep. But I woke up not an hour later to a horrible feeling of bugs crawling all over me. I've been having phantom feelings of bugs on me since then. Can someone please tell me what to do? My family don't believe me, and I'm scared. Right before I was born, my parents bought and moved into a house of an older couple that had just passed away. After I was born, my parents said a lot of freaky stuff started happening. Hearing footsteps upstairs, doors and drawers open then slamming, and a lot more, but they weren't really sure it was an issue. When I was 3, my parents said I would open the basement door every night and start waving to the bottom of the stairs, telling them I was waving to the boy in the basement. Around this time, my aunt came to visit one night alone and immediately told my parents that there were unsettled spirits in the house, and she opted to do a ritual to cleanse out the spirits, which entailed her burning herbs around and speaking to the spirits. Right after she did that, she said she saw a white flash in our living room. Following that, my parents said all the noises in our house had stopped, and I never waved to the basement again. A week or so later, my aunt told my mum that she thought the spirits followed her home, which my mum thought was bogus until she mentioned that my cousin had started waving to a boy in their basement, which, at that point, my mum told her for the first time that I had been doing that too. My aunt wasn't aware of this, and my cousin haven't even seen me doing this, so it wasn't like he was copying me. It still kinda spooks me out thinking that we basically accidentally verified that there was a spirit in our house, and that it migrated over. Update on Ping the Ghost. I was wrong about the girl telling us about the name Tex. My roommate actually used a Ouija board in our apartment without me there, and that's when the name came through. The first story I forgot about. One day while we were hanging out, one of my roommates left his medicine bottles on the kitchen table in this large plate with edges that we kept various items in on the table. The kitchen was connected directly to the living room with no walls in between. He noticed there weren't on the plate one day, which he emptied twice and looked through. He then went and tore apart his bathroom and bedroom to try and find the medicine. When he came back from his room, the medicine had appeared in the kitchen on top of the pile he had previously searched in the plate. The rest of us were sitting in the living room and watched him tear the place apart, including the plate with various items in it. The second story I forgot. In one of my roommate's rooms, he hung a hunting bow and fishing rods on a set of command strips high above the wall, directly over his bed. They were high enough so that you would need to swing a pillow at them and lay down in order to touch them without getting up. Keep in mind the bow and rods were on command strips, so they would have to have been lifted off. It can just fall off without the command strip coming off too. One night while his girlfriend and him were asleep, one of the fishing rods had fallen on top of her. It startled both of them. And on a separate night while she wasn't there, the bow had fallen off and almost struck my roommate. My roommate claims the fishing rods would somehow fall off the command strips on multiple occasions. I'm a guy in my mid-20s from an Asian country and a Muslim background. We believe in jinns and stuff like that, but I've never actually experienced anything paranormal in my entire life, and I kind of doubt their existence. But what happened with my dad is what really puzzled me. I've never seen him act the way he did when he met this ustaz, which is something like a priest to get rid of jinns. They're not exactly spirits since they're not dead. They're an entirely different race in the Muslim belief. They're made from fire, and us humans are made from earth, and the angels are made of light. That was sent from someone to disrupt my father's work. He was working on something big, and he had fired a lot of people for being lazy. I guess some of these people were mad and sent him these jinns to make his life miserable. My dad was struggling really badly, but now we're in a stable condition. We have enough money for our needs and are doing a bit better now. So he had this gym problem for a long time. We didn't notice when it first attached to him that these jinns can easily be missed because he doesn't pray and all that. Neither does my mum. Only my siblings and I pray, and we had to learn that by ourselves and got help from teachers and friends. So the thing that happened with my dad, this ustaz talked to this jinn inside my dad right in front of me at his friend's house. At first, this looked really silly because my dad was closing his eyes and then started talking in a weird way that I've never seen before in my entire life. It wasn't that weird, but it did totally go against his personality. The ustaz said to not disturb my dad anymore, and the ustaz started reciting verses from the Quran and pinching his shoulder, and my dad was sitting on a sofa while his eyes were closed the whole time, and he started laughing softly. When the ustaz said to leave him alone again, and my dad said repeatedly in an unusual way that he's feeling really hot, and all of that by reciting the ustaz, and the ustaz said to the jinn that if he wanted to be a Muslim and said no many times, then at this point I got really worried. I've never seen him like this and it was weird as hell. The ustaz asked how long it had been in my dad, and it said that it had been living in him for years. Like 9 different jinn are within him, and most of them left, but only a few came back, and this is the last time the jinn will go away. The whole time my dad talked weirdly and kept saying he's really hot in the ustaz's touch, and I saw his face turn red. The jinn didn't believe in any god, but in the end gave up and became a Muslim. I don't think it will last long though, because it probably said that to end the pain. And after the jinn left the body, my dad felt a lot better, and he couldn't remember much about the experience. My dad said he could feel someone talking behind his back, and also felt like he laughed a bit while the whole thing happened, but was having trouble remembering it all. Bear in mind this isn't a first-hand experience, as it was told to me by my mum. My mum had me at 19. She was a single mum with a rough upbringing, and as such, I didn't spend a lot of time with anyone. I was often home alone as she was working. Her parents had decided to disown her when they found out she was pregnant. Charming. I still don't know my grandparents. One day, I'm just in the apartment, I'm about 3. I'm playing and my mum said she wouldn't be gone long. She was nipping to the supermarket for some bits. I'm playing with my toys when I hear something and turn around. There I see a woman in a green dress wearing funny-shaped earrings. I give her a puzzled look, but ignore it as I'm used to adults being around the house. She comes down and sits and starts playing with me without saying a word. We were putting together some toys in a formation, soldiers or something like that. And then out of nowhere she's gone. When my mum gets home, I ask her who the lady in the green dress was because I really liked it. She said she didn't know and asked if I'd turned on the TV, to which I say no. Well, a few weeks later, after not bringing it up again, I see the green lady, but this time my mom is working in the kitchen. I tell my mom that I see the green lady and want her to tell me who she is, but my mom walks in and sees no one. At this point, the green lady has all but vanished, and I'm left confused, wondering why my mum can't see someone who is so very tangible to me. The third and final time I saw her was at night. I remember this was the only time I heard her. I was tossing and turning in my bed. I wasn't a good sleeper and was finding it very hard to fall asleep when I hear someone whisper, "Good night," into my ear. I turn around, but there's no one there, and I scream. I'm convinced it was the green lady, but I'll never know. I tell my mum, and shortly after that we leave the apartment, and I never saw anything again, at least according to my mum. I know the paranormal stuff freaks her out, so she might have only chosen to tell me this, and not anything that happened after. But I will never know. In any case, she was really scared, my mum, just telling me these stories.